Good morning, everyone. If you could please take your seats, we'd like to go ahead and get started so we can keep on schedule. I want to welcome everybody to the WIRE's fall meeting. We have a really great program lined up for our meeting today. Without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the WIRE's president, Will Sauer from Duke, and he will introduce our keynote speaker. So, Will, I'll let you come up and introduce our guest.
Thank you, Larry, very much. Welcome to the WIRE's fall meeting, and welcome back to Washington, D.C. I'm excited for this meeting. The panels that we have lined up are timely and relevant, both because they reflect issues that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the U.S. Department of Energy are grappling with, as well as areas that we are working closely with as members of the WIRE's group that we've been working closely on. And I'll start with describing the second panel of the day. This is a great opportunity to further explore existing infrastructure and integrating advanced technologies, and really how we as transmission owners have incorporated advanced technologies. And we have a great group to lead this discussion. From DOE, we have a renowned expert. We have a transmission owner who has really grappled with advanced technologies and integrating them with their system, into their system on an intimate level. And special thanks to Pete Baer from E&E News for moderating that panel. Many of our WIRE's members, particularly our associate members, have been integral in really developing new technologies, be it conductors, and other technologies. And that's one of the reasons I really enjoy WIRE's meetings is getting together, hearing about the latest and greatest, and how those technologies can be used really for our customers and bringing new efficiencies to our existing systems. And I know we'll get some more of that flavor on this panel, so I really look forward to that discussion. So for our first panel is on interconnection. And this it's a fascinating time to discuss interconnection because we're really in the midst of a generational change in how we integrate and interconnect new generation facilities. FERC, as we all know, recently issued a notice of proposed rulemaking which would propose to require all transmission providers to move to a first ready, first served cluster process. And this is an important step. Undoubtedly, and it's one that in principle reflects a clear improvement over the status quo. Obviously there are a number of other changes that FERC is proposing. We'll get into those on this panel. DOE is also going to be part of this discussion. It's clearly relevant. They excited to hear more about one of their recent initiatives called the Interconnection Innovation Exchange, or I2X. This effort brings stakeholders, data, best practices, and technical analysis all together, really for the betterment of interconnecting new technologies like solar and wind. And I'm very excited to see it grow. And lastly, we'll hear from MISO on this panel, who is one of the leaders in first ready, first serve, and really how their practices to pave the way can provide a path for other transmission providers. Again, special thanks to Amanda Connor from AEP for leading that panel discussion. And last but certainly not least, I'm pleased to introduce a good friend to many of us in this room, Eric Vandenberg. Eric, welcome, and we're all excited for your new position in the Office of Electric Reliability. It's a clear testament to how extremely hardworking you are and intelligent you are. Eric, I've had the pleasure of having much of my federal service overlap yours as well, and it's been a pleasure to see you grow. And anyone in the room who has worked at FERC or knows FERC can really attest how there are different silos at FERC, and a lot of the offices speak different languages, have different cultures. And Eric has been able to navigate that flawlessly, working in the Office of Policy, working in the Office of Reliability, and as well as OEMR and as advisor to a commissioner. And it's really this ability to speak different languages and work across those cultures that have really shaped Eric to being the true leader that he is at FERC. So Eric, we're truly excited for your willingness to jump in here, particularly at the last minute, and our thoughts are certainly with Commissioner Phillips and his family. And thank you more than anything else for joining us, and look forward to hearing from you. So, welcome.
All right, good morning, everybody. So, Will, first of all, thank you for the very, very kind and complimentary introduction. I appreciate it. Like Will said, I am Eric Vandenberg. I am currently the Deputy Director of the Office of Electric Reliability. If that sounds a little unusual to you, that's because last week I was the Deputy Director of the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation. So it's my 4th day on the job, so just everybody take it easy on me, okay? All right, so really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today, and of course would start off by saying that Commissioner Phillips sends his regrets. I know he would absolutely be here if he could, so I hope I can provide some interesting, informative content for you guys today. It's a great time to be speaking to wires, and really excited to see a lot of friendly faces in the room. We have a lot of transmission work going on right now. I think Commissioner Christie joked that we have about 13 different NOPRs out there, which is not too far off the mark, I think. So it's a little bit of an overstatement, but really is a historic time to be working on transmission-related issues. And I know this audience in particular is very, very plugged in and very sophisticated in terms of what's going on out there. So for today, I'm not going to go over and just rehash all of the things that we have out there. I mean, that would probably need 2 hours instead of 1 hour. So what I want to do instead is just talk a little bit about the importance of transmission with respect to reliability, because that is really what relates to my new role in the Office of Electric Reliability, and just how I see some of our ongoing proceedings fitting together with respect to the issue of reliability, and just a few of the things that we're working on and thinking about in the Office of Electric Reliability. So with that, first got to give my standard disclaimer. These views are my own. They don't reflect those views of the Commission or any of the Commissioners. So with that, we'll get into it, and I don't think it's going to surprise anybody to say that having a robust transmission system is really critical for keeping the lights on, and I think we've seen that just time and time again over the past few years. The most vivid example I think all of us are familiar with at this point was Winter Storm Uri, and the way the transmission system performed during Winter Storm Uri and how critical it was to keeping the lights on. During that event, there were about 15,000 megawatts of exports coming out of PJM, and those exports were critical to keeping the lights on in MISO and SPP. I think we've had many other examples too. Another one more recently. In early September, we had another major heat event in California. And during that time, the Pacific DC intertie and the California-Oregon intertie were again critical to keeping the lights on in California. I asked my staff to pull a couple of statistics, and by their count, approximately 20% of the energy that California was using during that event was from imports. So again, another really critical instance where transmission was very important to keeping the lights on. And conversely, we've also seen instances where that transmission capacity is not available and what the impacts are of that. Thinking back to 2018, MISO had a major cold snap early in the year that some of you may recall. FERC and NERC did a joint inquiry on that. And one of the findings from that was that the north-south intertie capability within MISO really was maxed out. And had there been another contingency in MISO South, MISO wouldn't have been able to serve that load, and it would have required potentially significant load shedding within MISO South. And then, of course, the most vivid example that we're all familiar with was Texas during Winter Storm Uri. Most of you know that the import capacity in ERCOT is limited to about 1,400 megawatts, and we all saw the deadly and very unfortunate consequences of that limitation during Winter Storm Uri. So we know that transmission is really important to reliability, and we also know that that's especially important during these instances of extreme weather. We heard a lot about that during the technical conference we hosted about extreme weather last June at the Commission. And not only is it important, but what we heard from NOAA during that technical conference is that we can expect these instances of extreme weather to continue and probably increase. So one of the things I think we've been learning as we've continued this conversation about extreme weather is looking forward, extreme doesn't necessarily mean rare, and so it's going to be something that we all need to continue preparing for in the future. So with instances of the extreme weather on the rise, we know that a robust transmission system is critical to keeping the lights on, but how do we make sure that that system gets built? So there's obviously a lot of factors that go into that, and we're all very familiar with them. There's the transmission planning process, there's the siting process, there's the rate making process, and those are all really important. But for today, I'd like to just focus on two things that are particularly in FERC's wheelhouse and my wheelhouse in particular. And the first one is the NERC reliability standards, and the second one is the regional planning process. So, since I'm from the Office of Electric Reliability, got to start with the NERC standards. And as my old boss, Chairman Chatterjee, used to say, those standards are the floor. They are the floor for reliable performance of the system, and they serve a very critical role in making sure we have an adequate level of reliability for customers. And those standards have traditionally focused on a lot of things that we're very familiar with. That's, N-1, making sure we don't have thermal overloads during those types of contingencies, making sure we don't have voltage instability, angular stability, all of those things that we as power system engineers are really familiar with. But as I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a couple of minutes, the Commission has proposed what I think is a really important proposal to raise that floor for instances of extreme weather, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. So, what the Commission has done in that proposal is they are proposing to direct NERC to essentially create a new or a modified standard that requires utilities to look at instances of extreme weather and make sure they are having an adequate level of system performance. So this isn't a completely new concept. If you look at the NERC reliability standards right now, TPL 001 in particular, this idea of looking at extreme events is already baked into the standard. But the observation that the Commission made when they made this proposal is that right now, a lot of this evaluation is voluntary, or there's very little guidelines around it. So if you have a lot of time on your hands and you really want to dig into the tables in TPL1, what you'll find is that you are required to look at these extreme events, but there's really not a lot of guidelines around what you have to look at or how you have to do it. So there's a bulleted list, and it's basically illustrative, and it says you can look at a number or any of these different things, and they include things like common mode failures of generation, extreme weather events, loss of a gas pipeline. And you as the transmission provider get to choose which one of those you want to look at and how you want to look at it. So that's the first issue that the Commission identified. There's not really a lot of guardrails around what you have to look at or how you have to do it. And the second thing the Commission identified was, even if you do that study and you notice some significant performance issues, there's no obligation to do anything about it. It's just a requirement to study. So given that gap in the reliability standard, and given the importance of having a robust transmission system in the face of extreme weather, the Commission is currently proposing to require the development of a new or a modified standard, so people have to do a more robust evaluation to look at these extreme heat and cold instances. And then again, if they find issues or performance violations, they have to do something about them to fix them. So I just want to talk a little bit more about that, because again, I think that is a really potentially significant step forward in the standards paradigm. So just to dig in a little bit, what the Commission suggested was having NERC create a standard that has certain minimum features. And what they suggested was having NERC establish a certain set of what they called benchmark events. So having NERC require the study of certain events that are based off historical or projected future weather conditions that are similar to things that we've seen in the past, and also representative of things that can be reasonably expected to occur in the future. Like, again, a polar vortex. A polar vortex, I think we all recall, that was an extreme event, but the probability of that occurring again in the future is essentially an actuarial certainty. It's just a question of when we'll have an event like that again. So establishing a benchmark event, establishing a level of performance that the utilities have to achieve during those types of events, and then establishing a requirement that if they see a performance violation, they actually have to come up with a mitigation plan. And consistent with the way the standards usually work, the idea would be to have a requirement that you fix it, but not specifying how. One of the, I think, very important paradigms in the standards regime is that they tell you what you have to do and not necessarily how you have to do it. So all of the transmission planning standards right now lay out as performance criteria, and it's up to the utility to figure out how to achieve that performance. And I think one very common sense way to achieve a lot of those performance requirements is through the construction of additional transmission. That could be intra-regional transmission to relieve some of those intra-regional constraints, or it could be inter-regional transmission, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a couple of minutes. So the last thing I want to mention about the Commission's proposal is it does specifically direct NERC to think about the use of probabilistic modeling. And I'm an engineer, and I apologize, so I'm going to geek out on probabilistic modeling for just 2 minutes, so just indulge me. I want to point this out because I do think it is important, because as we start thinking about things like extreme weather, considering new tools and techniques for the way we model the system and decide what types of projects we're going to build, I think is going to be increasingly important. Over the years, what we've seen is increasing levels of uncertainty on the system, and there's a lot of different drivers for that uncertainty. The weather is certainly one driver of that uncertainty. Unknowns about the resource mix and what that's going to look like 20 years from now, that's another level of uncertainty. And then the weather-driven nature of a lot of the resources on the system, that's again another layer of uncertainty. And so when you start to layer, should have mic'd me up, Larry. So when you start to layer all of these uncertainties on top of each other, what you get is a very complex problem. And going back many years, you know, the NERC standards and a lot of transmission planning has been very deterministic. That means the transmission planner kind of takes their best guess at what summer peak is going to look like, what winter peak is going to look like, and then goes from there. But again, as we're continuing to layer all of these uncertainties on top of each other, the effectiveness of that regime can start to break down. So again, just want to point that out. If you're interested in probabilistic modeling, or you have some extra time on your hands, which I'm sure nobody in this room does, I encourage you to check that out. So if the standards are the bare minimum that the utilities have to do, how do we get beyond that and we achieve more effective and efficient outcomes for consumers? And in my mind, that's where the regional planning process comes in. I see that regional planning process as another layer that sits on top of that foundation of the NERC standards and really gives utilities and stakeholders that opportunity to not just plan for the bare minimum, but really go above and beyond that and, you know, right size some of these projects to create really valuable outcomes for consumers. So I think that's not surprising to probably most of you in this room, but one thing I want to talk about is just how I see some of the proposals in the transmission NOPR from last April sitting on top of that foundation of the NERC standards. So the NOPR from April had a lot of different proposals. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. I won't recap all of them, but when it comes to how the proposal is expecting people to plan differently, there were a couple of key features. So first, it was asking people to look farther into the future than they might be right now, looking 20 years into the future rather than maybe the 10 or 15 you might be doing right now. Secondly, they're asking them to evaluate more and different scenarios. Again, not to say people aren't looking at scenarios right now, but I think the NOPR posits looking at a wider range of scenarios, including extreme weather. And then third, the NOPR is encouraging folks to look at a broader set of benefits than we have in the past. Previously, you know, a lot of benefits analysis has been really production cost driven, and what I took the NOPR as saying is there are a lot more benefits that you can and maybe should be incorporating into the process to really be capturing the value of transmission. So as we raise the floor that the NERC standards represent for system performance during extreme weather, I see those proposed process modifications in the April transmission NOPR as really creating a great opportunity for utilities to look longer term and think bigger about how to address this new reliability driver that the Commission is proposing in the reliability standards context. And again, by looking longer term and looking at a wider set of scenarios, that gives you as a utility a real opportunity to create right-sized projects that not just meet that immediate reliability need, which everyone is compelled to do, but to create some of these different right-sized projects that can really help create and drive consumer value. So I'm going to start wrapping up here, but before I wrap up, there's one other thing I want to mention, and that's another layer on top of the two that I just mentioned, the standards and the regional planning process, and that is the interregional planning process. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that the interregional planning process, or pardon me, the interregional coordination process from Order 1000 has not been very effective. I don't think we've seen really almost anything come out of those processes, and certainly not spurring the development of large-scale interregional transmission. But as I've noted up front, we've seen time and again the value that transmission can provide, particularly during those instances of extreme weather. So to that end, I did want to highlight that FERC staff is hosting a technical workshop on the issue of interregional transfer capability, and that's going to be December 5th and 6th. And that's going to really dig into a couple of key things, specifically whether and how to develop a minimum requirement for interregional transfer capability, the metrics for measuring that, and how you would go about implementing such a minimum. So I think that's going to be a really important discussion, and it's going to be really critical to thinking about the interregional transmission planning process. So I encourage you to tune in. If you went to the cost containment technical conference the other week and you were listening to discussions of an independent transmission monitor and formula rates, and you said, gosh, this just isn't weedy enough for me, I think this will be a great conference for you. So really encourage you all to attend. And with that, I'm going to wrap up and happy to take any questions you have.
Well, I just want to start off by thanking you, Eric, for coming in. I don't know if people here realize that it wasn't until very late in the day on Tuesday that we learned that Commissioner Phillips wouldn't be available due to a death in the family. That sparked a mad scramble to try to figure out what we could do in light of those circumstances. And after some effort of me working with the Chief of Staff over at FERC, we were lucky enough to get Eric to come in here and fill the gap. So that left Eric with about 36 hours to prepare the presentation, which you just heard today, and I think he did a fantastic job in light of that, along with the fact that he has a recent addition to the family that he's dealing with at home. So that may have kept him up, to work on the presentation a little bit more. But just really want to thank you so much for coming in. We really appreciate your filling in for us. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to others for some questions, but I guess I'm going to take the executive director's privilege and start off. It's typical for FERC commissioners to repeat the phrase that their job, reliability is job one at the commission, and they keep emphasizing that over and over again. You've talked about the importance of it, particularly in the context of extreme weather events that we're seeing with greater ferocity and greater frequency. We seem to be having 100-year events every year, almost now, somewhere. So Commission's trying to grapple with how to deal with that. It's going to require a lot of hardening of the systems, probably in some instances some level of redundancy, things along those lines. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of initiatives on the Commission that are focused on concerns about costs and how they wind up building out the system that are really more focused on efficiency, which means, you know, pushing things down almost to a level where, you know, there isn't a lot of slack, perhaps. And I don't like to use that word with transmission, I guess. But I guess I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how is the Commission going to balance these two seemingly somewhat incompatible efforts that they're trying to focus on?
Sure. Thanks, Larry, and appreciate you starting off with the softball. So I think you're right. You're right about a couple of things as usual. First of all, I do really believe job one at the Commission is reliability, and that is the message that I've gotten from every single one of our commissioners. So I think that is 100% true. And I think you're also right that there is a natural tension between needing to build a system that is reliable and resilient, but also managing the cost impact on consumers. And I think what you're all seeing in real time is the Commission doing its best to manage those two tensions. Again, I don't think it's an impossible task. I think at bottom that is our job, to manage those two tensions and strike a reasonable balance for consumers. But it's hard, and I think that's what you have seen as we've gone through the process with the transmission planning NOPR, with the interconnection NOPR, and then with this recent conversation on cost containment. So it's a really difficult job. I don't necessarily have any illusions that we're going to figure out that, you know, some easy and quick solution that'll definitely strike the right balance, but I think we're going through that process. We're gathering a lot of information, and I think as we start to take the next step on some of these initiatives, you know, the Commission will hopefully provide a little bit more insight into how it's hoping to strike that balance.
Hi, I'm Elliot Roseman with the U.S. Energy Association. Thanks for your comments. I have just a real quick comment, but then a question. The comment is that as part of this, you may want to take a look at some things that are going on in Europe. There are proceedings and rules, actually, with regard to something called the multi-area cross-zonal transmission, MACZT.
Yep.
So looks like you're aware of that.
Yep.
So there may be some lessons learned and some standards, actually, that might be useful for FERC to have a look at as part of this process. My question is, if you're looking more longer term, which, as you said, FERC is trying to stimulate, clearly there's going to be tremendous changes on both the wholesale and the retail level during that time. So, you know, with electric vehicles and demand side, and, you know, so many changes with the new technologies we're going to hear about in the second panel. So how do you, or how does FERC envision sort of the relationship between the retail and the wholesale level as you do more of this? That's not your jurisdiction, I know, on the distribution side, but clearly that's got to be part of the planning process, doesn't it?
Thanks, Elliot. Another easy question. I appreciate it. So I think you're right. The demand side and what's going on the retail side is really going to have potentially a significant impact on, you know, what the system of the future looks like. As you were talking, it kind of reminded me of a report that PJM did a couple of months ago where they were looking out into the future. I think they were looking at 2032, and one of the key findings from that report was that electrification and the way that proceeds could really shift where the loss of load risk is for their system. If there's an aggressive amount of electrification, that could really shift the main loss of load risk to the winter rather than the summer where it's traditionally been. So I think you're 100% right. I think some of those changes and some of those risks will just flow through into the normal processes. Like I said, loss of load expectation modeling, as load uncertainty continues to increase because of activity on the demand side or the retail side. Again, I think some of that just flows into the modeling naturally. But I think some of it doesn't necessarily flow naturally into the modeling, and I think that's why we at FERC are trying to think about, you know, systems and processes to make sure we're getting that data and incorporating it in the best way possible. future projections. I think one of those things, one of those mechanisms is Order 2222. I think that can be a really powerful vehicle for helping bring in the retail and distribution providers into the process. As some of you may recall, there are requirements to have the RTO coordinate with the distribution utility, and then obviously the aggregator has some insight into what is going on within its aggregation that may be on the distribution system. So I think those processes, again, I think can feed into what the RTOs are doing. And then I can tell you, at least in the Office of Electric Reliability, we're continuing to take a really hard look at modeling and thinking about whether transmission owners and transmission planners have the information that they need about what's going on the demand side to be making the right decisions. So at least for us, that's something we're continuing to look at. And then the last thing I'll make is, again, a plug for thinking about uncertainty in a new way. I think even if we start collecting a bunch more data, there's still just an inherently more significant amount of uncertainty on the system than there used to be. And so I think it's incumbent on us to continue to look for ways to grapple with that uncertainty in a better way than we have in the past, because even if we start to get a lot more data, and we start to collaborate more, there's just this inherent uncertainty. So I think we need to continue taking a hard look at the processes and the tools that we use to look for better ways to deal with that. I'm bracing myself.
Yeah. So congratulations on your new position, Eric. And I'm going to apologize because I'm not sure this is a softball, but I was really struck by the planning efforts and the third criteria you said, which is broader benefits. Mm-hmm. And that really is important. And as we look at both intra and inter-regional projects, I think the broader benefits are what is going to help to sell those projects. Mm-hmm. FERC can only unlock the top lock, but the states have the bottom lock that has to open for the door to open. And the states have to sort of agree that those broader benefits are benefits that they want to pay for, right? Because it all comes down to who's paying for these projects across states, whether it's intra or inter-regional. Any thoughts of how ranking of those benefits or developing those additional benefits and bringing the states along to say that those are the additional benefits that states are going to want to pay for? Because that's really what ultimately it's all about, to get the door open, right, is agreement to pay.
Yeah, great question, Stu. I think you're right. You know, there is a division of responsibility here, and the role of the states is critically important. I think that's why in the NOPR the Commission proposed really a new role for the states than they've had in the past, and that is actually a role in substantively weighing in on whether to approve some of these projects in the long-term transmission planning process. And I think you're right. You know, you want to make sure that the FERC could potentially dictate benefits that everybody has to use, but as you're saying, if the states don't find those valuable, then that may not make the most sense. So I think that's why the Commission proposed that new role for states, making them more involved in the process, not just another stakeholder that's commenting on the process, giving them kind of an opportunity for substantive input over the outcome. And then I think that's why the Commission also proposed those a very long list of potential benefits that RTOs could use, but proposed to essentially leave it to the RTOs to work with their stakeholders to work out which make the most sense for them. So I think I think the Commission and kind of the way they frame the proposal is recognizing what you're saying, but they also, again, seek comment on whether we should do something different, whether we should be mandating maybe a certain minimum set of benefits or a certain combination of benefits. So I think as usual, very astute observation, and I think that the Commission is trying to grapple with that.
Yeah, and I think everything you said makes a whole lot of sense, and the one piece that I heard at one of the federal-state collaboratives is that states might not want to participate because they are going to have to weigh in on a proceeding before them, and they can't get sort of ahead of their own state proceedings. But it's certainly a challenge to sort of work through this and figure out how to move forward.
I agree.
I don't think this is a hard ball or a curve ball, but
Thank you.
I'm going to ask. So could you talk a little bit more about how the Office of Electric Reliability works in conjunction with NERC or the FERC Office of a Division of Audits on compliance issues associated with the reliability standards? And through that process, are there any observations or lessons that your office sees coming out of those that would be helpful for transmission owners? Lessons learned or pitfalls to avoid in connection with compliance with the reliability standards.
Sure, great question, Larry. Yeah, I think, as you know, Larry, Office of Electric Reliability and Office of Enforcement have a long history of working together, and not only does Office of Electric Reliability focus on policy matters and standards development, but we also have responsibility for overseeing compliance with the reliability standards, and that is both monitoring NERC's compliance and enforcement programs, but also occasionally directly monitoring compliance with the reliability standards. So typically what we do is a certain number of audits per year, and that could be on some of the regular operations and planning standards, and more recently over the past couple of years with the focus on cybersecurity, we've been doing more of the SIP audits, and that's been a major focus for our office because, again, cybersecurity is one of the most significant challenges that we're facing as an office, a commission, and a country. So we typically do a limited number of audits every year, and what we do try and do is, again, not only look for compliance issues, but for issues that could in the future become compliance issues or other just concerns or issues that we feel like are worth raising for the regulated community. And what we like to do is not just keep those secret inside the commission, but provide those back to people. So our audits are providing not just a compliance value, but an informative value. And I believe just 2 weeks ago, we put out a report of some of our observations and findings and recommendations coming out of a number of critical infrastructure protection audits that we've done over the last year or two. So if you have any responsibility for SIP compliance in your organization, or you know somebody that does, commend you to read that report. There is a lot of really useful information in there.
I'll put my reliability hat on. So you did mention the future, more winter peaking, maybe different loss of load expectation, and we're shifting certainly to a different future with different mix of generation resources, but we know that dispatchability is critical, right, to meet reliability. Yeah. And I'm just thinking, there are certainly generation retirement requests that come in, and I'm wondering if FERC or maybe through NERC, doing anything to look at what the evaluation is for those, because my thought is that they could be very short-term analyses and units be allowed to retire, but if you really considered what's happening longer run, you might want to have some of the units, at least from a capacity perspective, even if they're not running, stick around a little longer. And is that something that maybe warrants some additional review to maybe provide some better guidance to those reviewing retirement requests to determine, how to evaluate that, considering, what's coming?
Another easy question, thanks, Tim. Yeah, no, really good question. So when a retirement request comes in, all of the RTOs have different processes for how they look at those. In MISO, I think it's the attachment Y process is about 6 months. PJM, I think it's like 90 days or 120 days or something like that. And so all of the RTOs have a process where they look at the transmission impact of those retirements. But again, that's typically just the transmission impact. It's not necessarily looking at a kind of longer term capacity planning standpoint. Most of the RTOs have these other resource adequacy mechanisms. They depend on to make sure there's adequate capacity over the longer term. So those processes are in place. I have heard people express concerns about whether there does need to be another mechanism to kind of be looking longer term to avoid what I've heard some people call a disorderly retirement scenario. And I think that's something that we're thinking about and we're taking a look at internally. I think, again, the way the regions, the extent to which that's a problem in different regions, I think varies. PJM and ISO New England, they have 3-year forward markets. So again, you should have some indication at least 3 years forward when we're running the auctions on time that, of who's going to be around and who's not going to be. New York and MISO, those are prompt auctions, so it's a little bit different. Again, I think my economist friends back in the policy office would argue that that's part of what a sloped demand curve does. Is it does procure some capacity above the minimum so that you don't kind of accidentally get into a shortage situation. But I think there's also been questions about whether there needs to be a more kind of administrative mechanism looking forward. So we do some of that already with our periodic reliability assessments that we do. We do our summer assessment and our winter assessment. Those are typically, just looking at the next, 5 to 6 months. But we are looking internally at whether we can or should build out a longer term capability. So I think that's on our mind internally, and I know I've heard some of the RTOs and other stakeholders thinking about that problem as well.
Thank you. So I think this is actually a softball, so I thought I'd give you a softball to be nice. Not really related to what you spoke about this morning, but I'm curious about how the commission is doing kind of post-COVID as far as working with staff, what it looks like in the building, remote work. I know every company is different and it's presented some unique challenges, but also some unique opportunities. So just wondered if you could shed some light on that.
Great, I really appreciate the question. So we're dealing with a lot of the same things you all are dealing with at your organization. We have officially reconstituted at 888 First Street. So folks are back in the building. We were on a very long, full telework thing until just September 12th. But as of September 12th, folks were required to be back in the building. That said, we do have a very flexible telework policy. I think the biggest lesson that we learned, like many of us learned during the pandemic, is we have great people and they're able to get the work done wherever they are. We have people that are really committed to the mission, and frankly, we saw some productivity increases during the pandemic because people weren't spending time commuting; they were working different hours, which again had pros and cons. So I think we're getting back into the swing of being in person like everybody else, but trying to also think about what the long-term future of our organization looks like. We have expanded the availability of remote positions within FERC, so we do have a certain number of, each office does have a certain number of remote positions that they've been able to hire for. We've got one of our remote employees here today, Dave Borden. Glad he was able to join us. So yeah, we've had a lot of success being able to recruit talent that lives outside the DC metro area, so that's been a really big boon for us, as well as the more flexible telework, again allowing us to recruit people who live further outside the DC area that might not be inclined to commute in every day. I think the flip side of that is, we've had difficulty integrating some of the new hires and kind of getting them ingrained in the FERC culture. And, you know, one of the things I think is best about FERC is its culture. It has a really collaborative, open culture, and I think some of that's a little hard to learn over teams, but we're doing our best and we're continuing to make headway on that front.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I really love the term reconstitute. I don't know who at FERC came up with it, but I think it perfectly captures it. And switching direction a little bit and a little more towards the next panel, I know that Stu talked about more end of life. Thinking more of interconnecting and beginning of life. I know that the FERC, the recent NOPR, especially around an affected system, discussed energy resources modeling versus network resource modeling. How does FERC look at the distinction between ERIS and NRIS to ensure reliability and say, I'm just thinking through situations where you may have a transmission provider who is looking at affected system modeling and may not believe that a energy resource modeling is able to provide reliability or is able to guarantee reliability and is looking for say, to use network reliability or network modeling. How should that transmission provider think through those decisions and different options? And again, apologize, I know this is your fourth day in this new office.
That's okay. I think, I do think it's a good question because you actually have hit on what I think is one of the most difficult engineering issues. You know, I think for me, as I considered what was in the NOPR, you know, I think the crux of the disconnect is that the NRIS and ERIS concepts were, you know, really born from thinking about serving, you know, your internal network load. You know, it kind of came up in 2003 when that was really the model of the world, was you had these network resources that were designated to serve native load, and then you had other stuff, which was the ERIS. So I think that's the way those concepts were born, and that came up, which didn't necessarily totally grapple with the idea that you have these resources on the border that can affect somebody else. So, you know, which of those two is the right choice under what right circumstances? I have no idea. Tristan's here. He's the lead on our interconnection rulemaking, so ask him on the second panel and he'll tell you the answer.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue, so thank you. And we really do appreciate you, Eric, stepping at the last moment here and gracing us with your presence.
So, my pleasure. I really appreciate it, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
Thank you.